My guest this morning comes to us from Washington, the Tobacco Institute. He comes to us traveling through Georgia, and we've invited him to Albany to spend some time with us. His name is Tom Howard. Born and raised in the Great Lakes region of upstate New York. He's been a broadcaster. Matter of fact, he's had unraveled murder mysteries to interviewing presidential candidates, and some of his news stories have appeared on ABC's Good Morning America. So you've had a varied background, which would not make me think you would wind up with the Tobacco Institute.
That surprises a lot of my friends, but I suppose I've always sort of felt that all of us reporter types had something in for the underdog. And I'm not sure that all of the public thinks of the tobacco industry as the underdog, but I certainly do. I think that there is lots of their side of the story, that when people are talking about tobacco, doesn't get heard.
Bad press?
Well, and some of it's awfully important, particularly here in Georgia, if you're going to talk about economic impact of tobacco. The tobacco economy in Georgia amounts to about $100 million a year just in state taxes, on excise taxes on cigarettes and sales taxes. There are some 54,000 acres of tobacco grown in this state, and that comes to more than 4,100 farm families.
Are you privileged to know, knowing that information, are you privileged to know what tobacco consumption has done in Georgia the past 10 years, let's say, 15 years?
I don't have real good figures on that. The thing that I can say is that that sort of surprises people is that nationwide consumption of tobacco and consumption of cigarettes has continued to go up over the past 20 years, with only a couple of exceptions, a couple of years. As a matter of fact, there's a chart here. Can I show
Sure. Tell you what, while you're talking, I'll hold it up and they'll get a shot of it.
The first really big push in the anti-smoking movement, as the audience probably knows, Gil, was in 1964. The first Surgeon General's report, and there was a slight dip that year in cigarette sales, but for most years since then, cigarette sales have continued to go up between 1% and 3% each year.
You raised an interesting analogy while in the lobby before we come into tape, that during times of recession, hard times, cigarette sales have in fact gone up.
And that's unlike most consumer commodities in this country. Now, there's some indications that there might have been a very slight decline in cigarette sales last year, but compared to other consumer products like alcohol, it was nowhere near as much of a decline. Of course, what we're looking at now is increases in taxes and a renewed, ever more zealous effort on the part of those who want to put the tobacco industry out of business.
Is that realistic, putting the tobacco industry out of business? Where do you get into a person's freedom of choice? In other words, if I choose to smoke, it's my right to smoke. It's someone's right to grow it. It's someone's right to make the cigarette.
I think that you've summed up what my philosophy. I would have said exactly the same thing. If you are an adult and you are an American, in our culture, I think that you should have the right to choose. And certainly we've been warned. The public surveys show that more people are aware of the warnings of the health hazards relative to cigarettes than most any other issue going today in the public. More people are aware of the Surgeon General's warning, in fact, than can name who the current President of the United States is. So once you reach that kind of saturation of information, I think we need to allow some freedom of choice. But there are organizations in this state and in other places around the country that are trying very hard in one way or another to take that choice away from you, to, for example, outlaw smoking in most public places. And there are laws in the books in some places where you can go to jail for lighting up in most public places. I think that's going too far.
Well, there are those who say as long as you know that, just stay away from those places. I mean, it's your choice. It's your choice not to go there if you can't smoke there.
I wouldn't be surprised, though, that we don't see here in the state of Georgia some efforts to make statewide legislation and even local legislation in a community such as this here in Albany that would tell people where and when they can smoke. We've seen those efforts all around the country. And I guess my point of view is that there do occasionally rise some differences and some problems even between smokers and non-smokers, but you don't need laws to take care of that. Hopefully we can solve them with some courtesy and some common sense.
There are those in our audience right now who probably lost a loved one to cancer who firmly believes that it was that cigarette that did it. It's awfully hard to talk to that person and tell him of the virtues of tobacco.
Well, I'm not sure that we're ever going to try and make anybody believe that there aren't any reasons to be warned about cigarettes or to be careful of what some people think the potential hazards are. But I also have people in my family who have died of so-called smoking-related diseases who never smoked. And who did not in any way get those so-called smoking-related diseases. In this case, 3 of them got emphysema from anybody's tobacco smoke. And I think that issues like that aren't paid enough attention to because some people are busy making tobacco the primary scapegoat. There are other factors involved.
There are organizations probably who sit back and looking for a cause, and they jump on that.
One of the causes that we're interested in, though, that we sort of side in the same place with the anti-smoking organizations, and you know that I have a
I know where you're going, so I'm going to grab the chart right now.
Is on teenage smoking. And I think that this may surprise your audience, and this may be a good example, Gil, of how if the public doesn't hear from both sides in a controversial issue such as tobacco, they're not going to hear the whole story. What have you been hearing about teenage smoking? You've probably been hearing that it's been going up. Well, in fact, the government surveys show that since about 1974, it's been going down among teenage males, and not quite as fast, but still going down among teenage females.
I think the youngsters are finding out that's not all that quote unquote big to be smoking.
Yeah, most of the evidence, most of the research that's been done on why teenagers smoke come up with 2 factors of rebellion against authority and giving in to peer pressure. And I think what we'd like to say in the tobacco industry is, you know, too often the one way you get kids to do something is to tell them not to do something.
Yeah.
But I really think that the whole freedom of choice issue involving tobacco it also revolves around adulthood. There are significant health allegations against cigarettes, and you do need to be mature in order to weigh those and decide what you're going to do. And it's the same for lots of adult customs in our society, whether it's starting a family or drinking alcohol or engaging in sex, or lots of other things that are being warned about today. Yeah. I think we need to give ourselves a chance to reach some measure of adulthood and then exercise our freedom of choice.
Yeah. Well, tobacco is in Georgia to the tune of $100 million into the state's coffers. So let's talk about tobacco in Georgia. Let's talk about tobacco growing. Exports. Are we a big exporter of tobacco, or are we that interested in exports? Do we consume about everything that we can grow?
I'm not sure of the order of your questions, so I lost my yes and no answers. But
all right, let me ask you again.
We are a big exporter of tobacco. In fact, if you look at the balance of trade, which is a big problem with the economy, in so many areas of consumer commodities, the United States imports much more than exports. In the case of tobacco, it's just the opposite. We export $2 billion more of tobacco and cigarettes a year than we import. So it's a $2 billion plus to the balance of trade.
Along those lines, I have been told by people who are supposed to know about these things that the foreign markets are a little concerned with the chemical residue found on our tobacco, not Georgia, but the United States tobacco, that in running some tests they have in fact found a lot of chemical residue, and that the foreign market's kind of turned off by this. Are you privileged to get into that?
I am not that aware of that particular issue. I am aware, however, that when it comes to the use of pesticides on all agricultural crops in the United States, there are a few places in the world that are more strict than we are. And in terms of the track record of American tobacco, it has always been thought to have been of the highest quality. That's one of the reasons why so much of the world is importing our tobacco, and we are importing so little of theirs.
Okay, along with that, and from being overseas myself, I've seen this. They will use the outer leaf, the outer wrapper of their cigarette product with our tobacco, but they will fill it with really inferior tobacco. So that leads me to believe that there might not be that much of a demand for our tobacco.
Well, in other countries in the world, when it comes to the sales of foreign cigarettes within that country, if you're in a place like France or Spain or Germany, if a consumer is going to buy a cigarette not of his nation but of a foreign nation, he almost always is going to pick up an American cigarette first. So we, in terms of the tobacco farmer and the cigarette industry, are very popular abroad. And very popular in this country. More than 99% of all cigarettes sold to Americans, interestingly enough, are American cigarettes.
With a 7-cent assessment now, a pound, and that's when it just recently went up to 7 cents, as I understand it. That is getting some folks talking about that perhaps the government's going to get out of the tobacco
price support.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why the tobacco price support has taken so much heat in recent years is because of the very zealous efforts of perhaps some sincere and well-intentioned people, but people whose primary concern is to get everybody to stop smoking, to make that choice for them.
You could throw in a government department on that, the Health and
Human Services.
Human Services.
And it's sort of interesting that if you look factually at the price support system, there are 13 different programs. Tobacco is only one of the 13 different agricultural commodities that fall under this kind of structure. And tobacco has always had the best record of repayment. And tobacco is the only one of those programs which has an excise tax attached to it. So while the program costs some dollars to the government, administrative costs, and some outlay in loans, those loans are almost always paid back, certainly better than the other programs. And on top of that, the government makes $7 billion a year in tobacco excise taxes. So the tobacco farmer is not being subsidized by the government. If anything, he's doing more than his share to subsidize government. And it's sort of interesting that if you're going to look at this whole price support structure, really in terms of economics, the one that's working the best is the one that helps out the tobacco farmer.
Folks in the audience who want to address some of the things we've been talking about, we have an address for you. You can write to the Tobacco Institute, 1875 I Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20006. And if you don't have a pencil handy, you can call me at the station and I'll give you that address. Speaking personally, and I shouldn't do this, but I will, at the opening of our conversation, we talked about this freedom of choice. I can sympathize with the growers of tobacco. It is a viable crop. It is, as I said, puts $100 million into the state's coffers, and
puts $600 million a year into paychecks here in the state of Georgia.
And there are those who say that it is a killer, and I just say that it's your choice. It's a freedom of choice.
And after you get past that freedom of choice, I think also we need to look sometimes at the emotional intensity of the issue. You know, if you look logically at all the things we're being warned about today, whether it's saccharin or coffee or whatever it's in today's newspapers, why is it that tobacco draws so much fire? I think part of the reason is that there's some emotional scapegoatism in here. And sometimes I think you need to get past that in order to delve into the real reasons of what causes disease. Sure, tobacco is statistically associated with some pretty scary things, but we don't know yet, no one knows yet, what causes a human cell to go cancerous. And we need to be encouraging more research to find out. The tobacco industry is doing that. The tobacco industry is supporting independent research to the tune of several $1 million a year.
And that not many people know that.
And we'd like to encourage that to continue.
We're out of time.
Thank you so much.
Tom Howard, thank you very much. Assistant to the President of the Tobacco Institute. Again, if you have any questions, write to that address, call me, and we can put you in touch with them.
Please do.
We'll be right back.